thanks for joining us on The Village online. I'm so glad that you're with us. And this has been an exciting last couple of days for us around the Village Church. Matthew and Alejandro, two of my favorite friends in the whole wide world, they got married yesterday, and I was able to officiate the ceremony, and it was truly one of the most beautiful, loving, Christ-centered weddings that I have ever been a part of in my life. And there were VIPs from all over the country. I was so impressed. People like Liz Dyer and Sarah Cunningham and Kathy Baldock, and I can't even remember everybody that was there. It was just phenomenal. And I wish you could have seen it. You would have been so proud. And I hope you can extend your love to Matthew and Alejandro. They are two absolutely beautiful humans, and I am so glad they are in my life. Hey, for the last several weeks, I guess months now, we have been looking at taking a new look at some old stories. And I really didn't know how this was going to flesh out. I wanted to start in Genesis, and we did, and look at some of the big stories in Genesis, and we did. And then we kind of rolled into Exodus, and I think maybe one more week in Exodus. And then I want to hit some other big stories, kind of the Jonah and the Ark story, and maybe a couple of other big stories, and then kind of wrap this series up. But I think it's been real helpful, and I have loved that you have written me, many of you have, sharing that it's given you a new perspective, a new way to look at some things, and that was my hope. Not that I would be right and someone else would be wrong, but just that I could say this is another way that you can look at an old story and you can find it to be unbelievably helpful and hopefully open me up to maybe a different way of understanding our spiritual walk. That's been my dream in this series, and I think that that's what's taken place. Well, in our last time together, we talked about the plagues, and I hope you remembered that, or if not, please go back and check it out. And then we talked about the miracle of the slaves actually passing through the Sea of Reeds with Pharaoh's army hot in pursuit, and being able to come through the waters and be saved on the other side. And they had finally escaped from Egypt, and that was a big deal. Once they reached the other side, they celebrated their deliverance. This will all be new, just kind of giving you the overview of the rest of the book of Exodus. Once they reached the other side, they celebrated their deliverance from Egypt with songs of praise. Miriam, do you remember that name? Miriam was Moses' sister, the one who had helped rescue him out of the Nile River. Miriam, the sister of Moses, was leading the women in dance. The picture is just a beautiful picture of people celebrating. They cannot believe they're free. The respite was short-lived, though, as they ventured from that dancing, celebrative moment in their history. They ventured into the wilderness, and the wilderness was going to be a 40-year journey. For 3 days, they wandered in the wilderness. They couldn't find any water to drink. Then they finally did find water at a place called Marah, and the water was bitter. You couldn't even drink it. It was horrible. So you can imagine the grumbling and the complaining. The Lord, according to the story, showed Moses a piece of wood, which when thrown into the waters made the water sweet. Moses did it. People were happy. They were finally able to drink some good water. Then the journey continued toward the desert of Sin, different kind of a name for a place, where the Israelites faced hunger. And again, they complained like crazy against Moses and against Aaron. In response, God provided something called manna from heaven. You've probably heard of manna from heaven, for them to eat every morning, and quail to eat in the evening. If you're not familiar with the term manna, manna is, according to the Bible, an edible substance which God provided for the Israelites during their travels in the desert, during that 40-year period when they're just kind of seeking for the way to get into the promised land. The people were instructed, when this manna was given, to gather enough for each day, just enough for each day. They weren't supposed to hoard it, and they were supposed to do that every day except on the sixth day. And on the sixth day, they were supposed to collect a double portion, because on the Sabbath day, they were not supposed to do any work, and so they weren't supposed to collect any food on that day. So that was an interesting kind of a thing. Then at Rephidim, the Israelites again lamented the lack of water, leading Moses to cry out to the Lord. There's a lot of passion and a lot of frustrations and a lot of anger Moses strikes a rock at Horeb with his staff and water gushes out, a big miracle. Then we come to Mount Sinai. That becomes the next significant stop in the journey. And it was here, you probably would know, Moses received the 10 Commandments, laws that would define the covenant between God and Israel. The Israelites, this was an interesting part of the story. And again, we're not going to cover almost none of this. We're going to look at kind of an overarching picture. So that's why I'm giving you these little things. But the Israelites, when Moses was up on the mountain, as the story goes, receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites grew restless during Moses' prolonged absence, and they fashioned a golden calf to worship, which breached their covenant. Moses interceded for the people and prayed to God not to kill them. And God only punished the transgressors, kind of the leaders of that escapade. He didn't destroy all of the Israelites, so yay, God, that was a good thing. And then the latter part of Exodus details the instructions given by God for the construction of the tabernacle, which was the portable dwelling place for the divine presence. And again, it's a lot of stuff. I would encourage you to read the book of Exodus, and I think you'll kind of get a sense of all of these little things that I've mentioned. But I wanted us to kind of take a big view of the whole thing. The story of the Exodus, found in the Hebrew Bible, is considered a foundational myth in Jewish tradition. A foundational myth. A foundational myth explains the origins of a ritual, or of a city, or of a people group. And that's what we have in the book of Exodus. I introduced a phrase last week that I think caused a lot of people's ears to perk up. But again, you've said that it was very helpful. Then the phrase was mythicized history. Do you remember hearing that phrase, mythicized history? That helps me when I read stories like the Exodus. Old Testament scholar Pete Enns said this: mythicized history is something that has a historical core. Something happened, but the telling of the story in the Bible is overlaid with mythical tones and mythical categories, because that's how ancient people told their stories. It has an element of history in it, but it's history that's overlaid with myth, which is powerful and meaningful and defining and penetrating. Most scholars, when they look back, they say that Israel, in their past, distant past, they were slaves. They probably were slaves. They probably were under powerful country. But somehow they were able to escape. And over time, those stories took shape and kind of were mythicized to become the stories that ultimately were written down hundreds, thousands of years after they supposedly happened. Enns continues and he says this: mythicized history is not the same thing as historicized myth. It's the exact opposite. Historicized myth is taking something that is fundamentally mythical and adding some historical elements to it to make it seem like it's historical. Mythicized history is a way of acknowledging that there is a historical basis somewhere way far back. Even if the biblical story is not what we would call historical, it's told in a way which people would have told stories back then. So again, way more information than maybe some people want, but I think many of you have wondered, how do we take these stories that are so, have such incredible things happening that just seem so beyond anything that we have ever seen. So the story delivered to us is highly mythologized, which means highly also theologized. There's a lot of theology, a lot of putting things in the story that kind of help the people understand why these things are a part of their religious practice. It's an interpretation of events that says something about the Jewish people's faith in God and what it means to be the people of God at that particular time, the time that it was written. The Exodus is a central event in the foundational myth of the Jewish people, and it has provided several important lessons that have shaped Jewish identity and their Jewish religious belief. Let me give you just a few of these things, and this is not the main part of the talk, but just so you kind of understand the way the stories were told kind of helped shape what Jewish religion was going to be about. Liberation from oppression. That's a big part of the story. That becomes a big part of Jewish DNA. We were slaves, but we were set free. God wanted us to be free. Covenant and divine intervention. The Exodus reinforces the idea that God had a covenant with these people. God wanted to walk with these people. God wanted to be a part of their lives. It highlights the concept of God's active involvement in the affairs of humanity. Again, that's a part of Jewish religion. Faith and trust in God. The Exodus story underscores the importance of faith and trust and obedience and believing in a higher power. Commemoration and tradition, that's another big part. The Exodus story emphasizes the importance of remembering and retelling these stories, remembering these stories and retelling these stories and being grateful that God was with them and God has led them to the place where they are now. And then finally, and there's many more of these, but finally, there is an identification with the stranger and with the vulnerable. I think because they were slaves, there is a sense of, in our religion, it is going to be central that we are kind to the foreigner, to the person who is not a part of this particular land, but might be traveling through. And that's the identification with the stranger and the vulnerable. These lessons from the foundational myth of the Exodus continue to influence Jewish society, or certainly should influence Jewish society even until this day. Now, what I have tried to do in our time is I've tried to kind of look at the stories with two-word phrases and just tried to give you just a little different perspective. So do you remember what the phrases are? No test, but you remember the first one, and I liked it a lot, invisible lines. You remember the whole point was, okay, the Jews are presented as slaves for 400 years, and we don't have much history, at least in our personal lifetimes, with people who are technically slaves. And so how do we think about people who might be in bondage? We said maybe we could see invisible lines around us and people living behind those invisible lines who are marginalized, who don't have the same opportunities that we have, who live much less of a life because of their position in life. Remember we talked about that? Then we talked about hesitant heroes. And again, that was just the idea that Moses is not presented as an arrogant leader type A personality and just stepping forward and saying, I'm going to lead these people out of bondage because that's just the kind of person I am. That's not the story. The story that we are told is of a person who didn't want to be the leader. He didn't want to have a confrontation. He didn't feel himself at all worthy of being able to take this mantle upon his shoulders. And so that was kind of the hesitant heroes, the idea that maybe you'll be asked to do things in your life that feel beyond you. And maybe there'll be times where you'll step up and you'll do some things that are beyond what you ever dreamed you could. Then we talked about silent storms. And again, I thought that was an interesting one because we looked at plagues. And in talking about the plagues, we talked about the idea that it was mythicized history. And we wanted to make sure that that was understood. But we also talked about the idea that when they practice injustice, when countries practice injustice, there are a lot of storms that are underneath the surface. And those storms ultimately will bubble up. And so that was the idea there. Then we talked about turning tides, the idea of them crossing the Sea of Reeds and how that was, just the winds blew in such a way that they were able to get through. We talked about in our lives, we look for things like that. And sometimes things like that happen. We don't know how. We don't know why. We can't explain it. We're not trying to see angels behind every bush. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just saying sometimes things happen that seem to just open doors for us that we never expected. Well, the phrase I want to look at today, and then we'll have one more phrase the next time we're together, is the Exodus expedition. The Exodus expedition. And expedition, I know you know it as a vehicle, but the definition is a journey or a voyage undertaken by a group of people with a particular purpose, especially that of exploration or scientific research. And so that's what I want us to think about, the Exodus expedition. What was happening? Why were they on this expedition? Why did it take 40 years? One of the things I have always found interesting about the story is that it takes 40 years for Israelites to go from Egypt to the border of the Promised Land. 40 years. It should have taken, by all accounts, it should have taken about 11 days. But it takes 40 years. And it's not so much that they got lost. If you remember the story, God is leading them, a pillar of clouds by day and the pillar of fire by night. So God is leading. It's intentional. They are just led around the desert for 40 years. Now, a story happens early in their wilderness journeys that kind of explains a little bit of what this is. Again, part of the story. And so let me just tell you what that is. It's found in Numbers chapter 13, verses 1 through 33. But it's also found a few differences in the story, but Deuteronomy chapter 1, 22 through 40. Here's how the story goes. Israel reaches a place called Kadesh Barnea, and they ask God if they could send spies into the promised land just to see how great it is. I mean, they're excited. They can't believe they're on the edge of going in and having this whole new life, and they just can't believe it. And God says, yes, that'd be wonderful. So they select one man from every tribe. You remember how many tribes there were of Israel? There were 12 tribes of Israel. And so these 12 men are going to go spy out the promised land. And they return and they acknowledge it is more unbelievable than we have ever been told. It is beauty on top of beauty on top of beauty. It is the land of milk and honey. But 10 of the guys said that they had no chance against such strong cities that were in the promised land. That there were armies that were on the other side, and the Hebrews would have no chance against them. There were only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, 2 significant figures in the Old Testament, who said, we can do this. Of course we can do this. But the other 10 said, no way. Now, because the other 10 gave such a bad report, Numbers chapter 14, verse 34, this is the Lord, this is kind of a curse on the people. According to the number of days which you spied out the land, they had spied it out for 40 days. For every day you shall bear your guilt a year for over 40 years. In other words, because you had no faith and you were there for 40 days, I'm kind of penalizing you a year for every day you were there. So 40 years, you're not going to get into the promised land for 40 years. 40 is a symbolic number in the Bible. It's mentioned 146 times in Scripture. It generally symbolizes kind of a period of testing. 40 days in the wilderness, Jesus, fasting, praying in the wilderness. It can mean a trial, or it can mean a period of probation. Moses, Elijah, Jesus, they all fasted 40 days. Goliath taunted Israel for 40 days. The rains fell on the earth during the Noah story for 40 days. The Exodus story says it could have been an 11-day journey, but because of your lack of faith, there's a lot of lessons you're going to have to learn, and it's going to take 40 years before we go into the promised land. So what we have in the Exodus story is kind of the crucible of character development. It's like, you guys aren't ready. You men and women are not ready. There's got to be a lot of things you have to learn before you can go into the promised land. The journey through the wilderness was as crucial as their liberation from Egypt. It was a time of learning. It was a time of growth. It was a time of transformation. The wilderness represents the challenges that we face, that people face, and the growth that can come through the wilderness. So that's what it becomes for them. It becomes lessons that they needed to learn. For the Jews, there was 400 years of slavery that had to be unlearned. And when you see the 10 Commandments, that's something that I've always tried to think about. When you see the 10 Commandments, you think, are those the best? Is that the best laws that we can come up with? But a lot of it was, I think, trying to help people who had been slaves see things differently. For example, the Sabbath, the law of taking one day a week. If you've been a slave your whole life, you don't have a day off. You don't even know what a day off means. You don't even know what that's about. You work every day, sun up till sundown, every single day. But it's like, no, you're not slaves anymore. You're not slaves anymore. We're going to work on more than just your work. This is going to be soul building. This is going to be some things that's going to help you internally. So you're going to rest for a day. The idea of respecting people's property, respecting things people have, those are things that slaves would have to learn. And so that was a part of this whole process. Now, here's what I want to talk about today, just in the few moments that we have left together. And it won't be long, but just some things that I was thinking about is what wildernesses are you navigating? What are you walking through right now? Maybe you've been in it for a while, but maybe you think this is a part of the plan. This is a part of you opening your eyes to some things that maybe you've not understood before. I think that's a real legitimate thing for us to think about. I want to talk about one primarily, and it is the one that I have seen most prevalent in our church with the people that I have met over the last years. It is the one that has been most realized in my own life, and that's the wilderness of a spiritual walk, my spiritual walk. When I say that, what I'm trying to get across is I have been on this journey for a long time, since I was a young teenager. And what I have discovered is, especially over the last 15, 16 years, that I have learned things and I am not the person that I once was. This journey that I've been on has actually been a very fruitful journey that has taken me to a place that I never dreamed I would be. A few weeks ago, I found a box of old sermons of mine from 1984. And I bought myself a cassette recorder. I didn't even have a cassette recorder, but I bought a cassette recorder and I listened to them. I actually downloaded them, bought a little contraption that I could put it into my computer. And I don't know that I'll ever listen to them again. It was, in many ways, unbelievable where I was as a young pastor and how I presented the message of Christ, how I talked about Jesus, how I understood God's connection with humanity and our connection with God, how I talked about what people should do as they recognize that relationship. I was shocked at where I was in 1984 and where I am now. And then as I began thinking about this story, I began to think about, well, I could see over the last years kind of being on a wilderness journey myself, where I've had some ups and some downs. I've had some moments when I thought I was really learning some things. I've had some big setbacks. But what I have discovered is I have been getting prepared for the better life that I believe God is leading me into. So what I want to do is I want to just quickly share some things that were a part of what I originally thought I knew. And then through the journey, what I am learning. And I don't know where you are on the journey. Maybe some of this will resonate with you. Some of this might sound heretical to you. And I no qualms, I get it. I totally get it. I'm just saying I have been on this journey, and these are some of the things that have happened for me, to me, and maybe it'll resonate with you as we think about the wilderness as it relates to our spiritual journey. I remember learning, kind of this was one of the core beliefs that we had, was that we were born separated from God. You've heard that. You were born a sinner separated from God. And that's been a part of Christian theology since about 400 AD, about 400 years after Christ. And most people have believed that for 400 years, but I don't think that it is true. But that's what I believed, separated from God. And God has to create these things that will get us ultimately back in good standing with God. That was a part of what I believed early on. That's what I believed when I listened to those sermons. That's what I was saying, things about that. I learned that how to get into the religion, how I was supposed to kind of get into it. And then because it was the way I got into it, I was taught that was the way everybody else had to get into it, was the same way I got into it. And so that was a part of what I believed. I learned that there were outsiders and insiders, and I was an insider, and everybody in our church, they were all insiders, but it was real obvious that there also were outsiders. Some people were kind of insiders if they went to other churches that were similar to our church, but then there were a whole bunch of people that definitely were outsiders, and we were aware of that. We would have been kind to them, hopefully, but they were definitely outsiders, and we treated them like outsiders. We learned, at least the way I grew up, that there were big sins and there were little sins. Big sins seemed to always kind of revolve around sexual stuff. That seemed like that was a big thing, a big taboo. Little sins, kind of racism, ugliness, lack of generosity, judgmentalism, those kind of things. Those kind of little things. We wish we could tweak those, but big ones, yeah, well, that was the big sins. I learned there were minimal requirements that proved my allegiance. Pretty much if I went to church every Sunday and didn't cuss much, those were kind of minimal requirements. If I could do that, then I was kind of living the life. I believed that the big thing was to believe that our way was the true way, and I did. Our way was the true way. Everybody else was on an inferior path. Some people maybe were close to our path, but ours was the big path and was the right path, and we thought everybody should get on our path. That was a part of what I believed. I learned that the political process was to make sure that how we believed should be kind of the law of the land, how we believed about things, and that we would need to elect people that believed like we believed, and we would do that. So certain laws would definitely be changed. People would have to do kind of the way that we wanted it done, and didn't really think about other people and what maybe would be best for other people. We just pretty much wanted it to reflect kind of us. We learned that people who were different from us should be loved, but they should change. People different from us, they should be loved, but they should certainly change. We learned that in life, answers were real simple. Just follow God's word. Just do what's in God's word. Just believe the Bible, do the Bible, and you'll be okay. We learned that if people were in poverty, it probably was because they had some issues and they needed to not be given much help, because then they would become dependent, and they needed to just pull themselves up and live the way we were living and just do the good things we were doing, and that would be enough. We learned that attendance at church was the main thing. Boy, go to church every Sunday. That was the big deal. And man, I didn't miss Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday. Fortunately, I liked it. I loved the people that were there. I enjoyed kind of the whole vibe that was there, but that was the thing, go to church every Sunday. And we learned that if we did the things that lined up with our religious upbringing, then when we died, we could have confidence that we were going to heaven. And that was kind of locked in. That's kind of what I believed. That's what I was preaching back in 1984. But then I got on this wilderness journey, this expedition that has changed some things. Because we are not struggling when we're on this spiritual journey. We're not struggling like someone in a desert. We're not struggling like that. Many maybe never have considered that this is an expedition that could be looked at like an Exodus expedition, where you're leaving something and you're getting ready to move into something else. Maybe you've not even thought about it like that. Even some people go farther and they say if you're even contemplating leaving what you had grown up in, then that's heretical. You should not do that. You should never question your religion. But I think most of us have grown way beyond that. We've understood that we're grateful for the good things that we learned when we were growing up. But spirituality, of course, should be something that we are growing in, that we are learning more about, that's becoming deeper and richer. And just because an old preacher said something to us when we were 13 years old, regardless of how well-meaning he might have been, doesn't mean that that was the ultimate only truth and that you should never consider anything else. That's a huge misunderstanding. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about what are some things that for me have changed. And I just jotted some down, and I hope this will be helpful to you. One of the things that I have thought about is the idea that on this journey, we're not separated from God at birth. That was something that was really drilled into me, that we were all born separated, that babies had a sin nature, and that made God impossible for them to be connected to God. But we have changed. We understand that way different. We believe that God is present with every person. And I want you to know that has been a huge step up for me in being able to look into every person's eye and not seeing them as outsiders, separated from God, a million miles from God. I've got God in me, they don't have God in me, but to look into people's eyes and know God is there. They have the divine DNA in them. God's presence is there. God is in everyone. There's not a ticket that you have to get stamped to be in God's family. Spirituality is more about learning how to live out our lives with God's love flowing in us and through us. We're learning that there are no insiders and outsiders. We're all children of God. We come from different places. We may have different beliefs, but that's just in our mind. We all are children of God. We're learning that there are no big or little sins. Life is about learning to walk in love. And when you walk in love, you kind of feel things happening like in a divine presence kind of a way. When you move from that and you squash love flowing through you, then you find that it's less than what it could be. We've learned that spiritual arrogance is an oxymoron, that it shouldn't be that way, that being spiritually arrogant and thinking that we have all the answers is a silly thing. That one of the things that should be true about all of us is we should be humble and understand that we are learning, but we don't have all the answers by a million miles. We don't. God is so beyond our small understanding that we can learn from people all around the world, all different religions. We can learn. We can certainly say that the Jesus story resonates with us. The Jesus story is the way we have understood faith, but we are not going to be so arrogant that we're going to say other people don't have an understanding that can also be true. We've learned that people are different. And you know what? That difference is okay. It's one of the most beautiful things in the world. And the differences people have can be celebrated and championed and cheered for. And people who are different shouldn't be made to feel like they are less than. They're different. We're all different in some ways. We've learned over the last years on this journey that the Bible was never intended to be a rule book. People who make the Bible a rule book, I feel like they are, number one, they are picking and choosing what rules they want to follow. And people say, no, that is not true. We follow every rule. No, you don't. We follow the rules that are easiest for us. I remember a long time ago hearing this story, and I believe that it's true. Churches in West Texas where swimming, mixed bathing was considered a sin, boys and girls swimming together. Well, there's no water in West Texas. It wasn't really a big deal, but you go to the churches in Florida, and because they were around the ocean, kids just grew up kind of swimming together. It wasn't that big a deal. I remember hearing the Billy Graham team went to Germany. This is back in the early 70s. And the German Christians were meeting the Graham team when they arrived, and the plane landed and they were waiting for them, and the Graham team came off the plane. And the German Christians were kind of shocked that the women's dresses were a little higher than they thought was proper. And the Graham Christians were shocked that the Germans drank beer with their meals, and they just couldn't believe that was the way it was, because we look at other people and we're able to say, well, that's wrong, but what we do is right. Legalism is always that way. Anyway, didn't mean to get off on that, just to say we are learning that it's not about that. You don't see the Bible as a rule book. We read the Bible to see how people thought about God thousands of years ago. What were they understanding? How were they perceiving? What was new information for them? What were things that were added to the human spiritual experience that had not been there before, that maybe was a new understanding? And then we take those things and we grow and we build on those things. And then we trust the Spirit of God to lead us, not the Bible to lead us into making correct answers about all situations. We ask the Spirit of God in us with an understanding of love to help us understand. We're learning that we have no idea what people deal with in their lives. That's why we should never be judgmental of people. We have been so judgmental, I think, the Christian church, by and large, at least my background in the Christian church, towards poor people, not understanding that we don't know what they've gone through. We don't know what situations they're having to deal with, and that Jesus says a whole bunch about how we are supposed to love and help those who are poor. We've learned that getting together at church can be a beautiful thing, and we love it. When you can come and be a part of our fellowship or any fellowship, we absolutely love it. But you know what we've learned? We've learned that that's not the big deal. That is not the big deal. It would be better if you had to choose one or the other. It would be better for you to love and be kind and generous to people around you than to come to church every single Sunday and not love and be kind and generous to people around you. Church can be beautiful, but it's not the main thing. We're learning that we don't know all the answers either about what is beyond this life. We do believe, I believe that there is life beyond this life. But people say, what's it like, Ray? Is it streets of gold, walls of jade? What's it? I have no earthly idea. In fact, the best thing that I have read about it is Marcus Borg in his book, Speaking Christian, Why Christian Words Have Lost Their Meaning and Power. Borg said this, "So is there an afterlife? And if so, what will it be like?" I love this. He said, "I don't have a clue, but I am confident that the one who has buoyed us up in life will also buoy us up through death. We die into God. What more that means, I do not know, but that is all I need to know." And I have learned over the last 40 years, 45, 50 years of being on this journey, I've learned some things I think a little clearer than maybe I thought I knew when I first started. And I hope you'll feel that way. I hope you'll realize this is not about having all the answers. We don't. This is about seeing it as a journey, an expedition, where we're experimenting, we're learning what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what makes us more like Jesus, what makes us less like Jesus, and then having the courage to do those things. What I've discovered is some of the finest people in the world are on that journey, and they are lovely. And they too would say, listen, we don't have all the answers, but they are just trying to be a loving example of what it means to have a heart open to God and a heart that wants to follow the life of Jesus. I hope this makes sense. That's the way I can process this Exodus expedition. I can think about areas in my own life where I've had to be on a journey to try to learn things a little clearer, and maybe that will be helpful to you. May I have a word of prayer? Let's pray. Gracious and everlasting God, as we reflect upon the journey of the Jewish people through the wilderness for 40 long, long years, we recognize the profound lessons nestled within their pilgrimage. We give thanks to you for your steadfast presence, your unfailing provision, and your guidance, which is as relevant to us today as it was to them in their Exodus. May we learn to depend on you in our own wanderings, to trust in your timing, to embrace the transformations that come from our trials. Help us cultivate a spirit of perseverance, communal support, and faith as we navigate the complexities of our modern world. In moments of uncertainty and challenge, remind us that you are the God who brings water from the rock and manna from heaven, the God of the impossible. Encourage us to work towards a promised land of justice, peace, and love for all of your children. As we journey forward, may we do so with humility, learning from our past, and hopeful for a future where your kingdom is realized more fully on this earth. And we pray this in the name of Jesus, our God and our peace. Amen. Thanks for watching.
There are 3 ways you can give to support the love-focused, culture-changing, ever-evolving, community-building, Jesus-inspired work of the Village Church. You can text the word GIVE to 404-998-8979, and you can give online at thevillageatlanta.com. Or you can send a check to the Village Church, 3418 Dogwood Drive, Hapeville, Georgia, 30354. Have a great week.